Welcome to today's explainer. So, if you've got a vector calculus exam coming up and your head is just completely spinning from nablas, del operators, and cross products, well, you are in the exact right place. We're treating this as your ultimate strictly structured exam study guide. Today, we're going to completely demystify the big vector operators. We'll be breaking down the gradient, divergence, curl, and the Laplacian. We're going to extract exactly what you need to memorize, highlight the core definitions, and list out the essential practice concepts to help you dodge those common traps that always cost students points on test day.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Section 1, Mastering the Gradient. Then we move to Section 2, Divergence, Spread, and Sinks. In Section 3, we'll cover curl, tracking the rotation. And finally, we'll tackle the boss level in Section 4, the Laplacian operator.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Mastering the Gradient.
Okay, before we even look at a formula, it really helps to mentally prepare for what this operator actually does. Think of it as a transformation tool. There is a non-negotiable foundational rule you have to know right away. It is defined for a scalar. You literally cannot take the gradient of a vector. The gradient of a scalar is always a vector quantity. So you input a field of single numbers, kind of like a temperature map of a room, and the gradient spits out a field of arrows pointing in the absolute steepest direction of increase. Scalar in, vector out. That's your golden rule.
Now, when you're calculating the gradient across different coordinate systems, there's a major trap you need to watch out for. We've got Cartesian, spherical polar, and cylindrical. Cartesian is super straightforward, right? It's just partial derivatives with respect to x, y, and z attached to your I, j, and k unit vectors. But you've got to pay close attention to the non-Cartesian systems. For spherical polar, you have scaling factors sitting in the denominators. There's an r under the theta derivative and an r sine theta under the phi derivative. And for cylindrical, you have an s scaling factor under the phi derivative. When you're scribbling these out during an exam, please do not forget those denominators or your vector direction is going to be completely off.
To save you a massive amount of time on your exams, there's actually an incredibly handy general formula you can use. If a question asks you to take the gradient of a radius raised to a power n, you really don't need to grind through all those partial derivatives from scratch. The gradient of r to the power of n is simply n times r to the power of n minus 1, all multiplied by the unit vector r. Or, if you're using the full vector r instead of the unit vector, it's just n times r to the power of n minus 2. Memorize this shortcut for sure. It'll save you precious minutes when you're on the clock.
Moving right along to Section 2, Divergence, Spread, and Sinks.
So we're shifting gears now. We've mastered taking scalars as inputs, and now we need a tool that takes vectors as inputs. And the definition here is quite beautiful. Divergence is defined for a vector, and it literally means spread, as in how much a vector field spreads out in space. If the gradient was all about the slope, divergence is all about the flow. Are things expanding outward from a specific point, or are they compressing inward? And notice that because we're using a dot product between the del operator and our vector, our output here is going to be a scalar. We are back to a single number representing that total spread.
To really visualize exactly what we mean by spread, imagine a central point. If you have arrows pointing outward from that center, that's what we call a source, and it means you have positive divergence. Now flip that around. If all the arrows are pointing inward toward the center, that's a sink, which represents negative divergence. And here's a really crucial detail. If the vector arrows are all the exact same length and there's no change in magnitude as you move along, you actually have zero divergence. Basically, nothing is being created and nothing is being destroyed.
When it comes to calculating that spread, the math presents another major hurdle where students constantly drop points. Take a look at the spherical polar and cylindrical formulas. Cartesian is easy. Partial of ax with respect to x plus partial of ay with respect to y plus partial of az with respect to z. But jump into the spherical formula. For the r component, you have 1 over r squared multiplied by the derivative with respect to r of r squared times ar. That r squared is literally trapped inside the derivative. You have to multiply your vector component by r squared first and then take the derivative. The exact same rule applies to the sine theta in the second term and the s in the cylindrical formula. Whatever you do not pull those scaling factors outside the derivative. Just like we had with the gradient, there are cheat code general formulas for divergence when you're dealing with radial fields. The divergence of r to the power of n times the unit vector r gives you n plus 2 all multiplied by r to the power of n minus 1. And look at that. Taking the divergence of this vector field leaves you with a scalar result. These quick reference rules are absolutely essential to lock into your memory for test day. They act as fantastic, quick sanity checks when you're working through those longer manual calculations.
Next up is Section 3, Curl, tracking the rotation.
All right, moving to our third core concept. This keeps us firmly in the vector input world, but it measures a completely different physical property. While divergence measures the linear spread, curl relates entirely to rotation. Specifically, how much a vector rotates about a given point in space. Think of it like this. Imagine dropping a tiny paddle wheel into a flowing river made of your vector field. If that paddle wheel starts spinning, you've got non-zero curl. And unlike divergence, which spits out a scalar number, calculating the curl requires a cross product. The output of curl is always a vector, and it points directly along the axis of rotation following the right-hand rule.
Now, calculating curl manually can be an absolute algebraic nightmare if you try to just memorize the final expanded string of polynomials. Trust me on this. The most reliable strategy for your exam is to memorize the determinant structures instead. For Cartesian coordinates, it's a 3x3 matrix. You put ijk on the top row, the partial derivatives in the middle, and your vector components ax, ay, az on the bottom. Easy enough. But for spherical and cylindrical, you have to watch those scaling factors again. In spherical, you've got an r and an r sine theta hanging out in the top and bottom rows, plus a 1 over r squared sine theta sitting all the way outside the matrix. If you memorize the matrix setup, you'll dramatically cut down your chances of making a silly algebra mistake.
So we've talked about what positive divergence and active curl look like, but let's pause for a second. Think about this crucial exam-style question. What actually happens to a vector field when these operators result in exactly zero? What kind of physical properties do these zero states represent?
It is incredibly important that you know the exact terminology for these zero states, because professors absolutely love to test on this. If the divergence of a vector field A equals 0, that field is called a solenoidal vector. Think of a magnetic field, right? It has no sources or sinks. It just loops continuously. Solenoidal means divergence is 0. On the flip side, if the curl of a vector field A is 0, meaning there is literally no rotation happening in the field at all, it's called an irrotational vector. Lock these two terms side by side in your brain right now.
And if we look at the general formulas for curl, they actually reveal a surprisingly simple pattern. The curl of all these basic radial and angular forms, whether it's r to the power of n pointing along the r, theta, or phi unit vectors, or honestly even just the full position vector r itself, every single one of them just equals 0. These basic radial fields point straight outward, or they follow simple angular paths without ever twisting back on themselves. So naturally, they're entirely irrotational.
Let's see how all of this builds toward our finale. There's a really specific, critical insight to keep in mind here. Div, grad, and curl, they are all first derivatives. Up until now, we've just been taking a single partial derivative of our fields. But what do you think happens if we apply the del operator twice?
Which brings us to section 4, the Laplacian operator.
Welcome to the boss level of our vector toolkit. This is where the math really starts revealing the hidden architecture of physical space. The very first thing you need to know about the Laplacian, which is denoted by del squared, is just how incredibly versatile it is. Unlike the gradient that only takes scalars or divergence and curl that only take vectors, the Laplacian is defined for both scalar and vector fields. It represents the second derivative in space. Basically, it tells you how the gradient of a field is diverging. It's a measure of how much the value of a field at one specific point differs from the average value of its surrounding neighborhood.
Seeing the Cartesian formulas in action makes this a whole lot clearer. For a scalar field t, del squared t is just the second partial derivative of t with respect to x, plus the second partial of t with respect to y, plus the second partial of t with respect to z. The result is a scalar. But if you apply the Laplacian to a vector field A, your output is a vector. You're basically just taking that scalar Laplacian operator we just described, and you're applying it individually to the ax component in the I direction, the ay component in the j direction, and the az component in the k direction. I know it looks super intimidating, but honestly, it's really just 3 scalar Laplacians wearing a trench coat.
As we wrap up this ultimate study guide, I want to leave you with a thought that goes way beyond just passing your exam. We use these exact mathematical tools to model everything around us, from fluid dynamics to electromagnetism all the way to quantum mechanics. If divergence, gradient, and curl only scratch the surface as first derivatives, showing us the immediate slopes, spreads, and spins, what hidden physical geometries do second derivative operators like the Laplacian truly reveal about the actual fabric of our universe? Master the mechanics we covered today, and you'll be well on your way to answering that question for yourself. Keep practicing those determinant structures.
Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer, because we are going to completely shift how you think about vector calculus. If you're like most of us, You probably remember it as, well, kind of a chaotic mess of equations and Greek letters, right? But today, we're going to transform all of that into one beautiful, repeating architectural pattern. I mean, I definitely know the pain of memorizing a dozen different formulas across all those coordinate systems. It just feels like endless rote memorization. But what if I told you that you literally don't have to do that? Today, we're unpacking this single underlying mathematical secret that powers absolutely all of them. So here's our blueprint for today. We'll start with the big secret: how boundaries meet interiors. Then we'll climb the dimensional ladder, lay down the closed surface rule, open up the universal coordinate toolkit, and finally decode those math operators. Easy, right? Let's go. All right, step 1, the vector calculus secret. We really need to start with the absolute most important paradigm shift you've got to make to actually understand how this entire mathematical system works. And this concept brilliantly illustrates the underlying rule of the universe. It's all about the connection between a boundary and an interior. The big secret of vector calculus is actually pretty simple. Calculating something super complicated on the inside of a space is perfectly mathematically equal to just measuring its outer edges. The theorems, they're literally just the translation engines between the two. Think of it this way. Imagine you've got a sealed room. Instead of painstakingly measuring every single inch of the air inside that room to figure out what's happening, this math says, hey, you can know everything about that interior simply by analyzing the boundary, the walls that surround it. Okay, moving on to parts 2 and 3, climbing the dimensional ladder. Now we're going to zoom out a bit and watch this exact same boundary rule scale up perfectly across different dimensions. It's the exact same pattern, just kind of evolving in complexity. We're going to climb this ladder step by step. We'll look at 1D lines, 2D surfaces, and 3D volumes to see exactly how the math translates our room and walls analogy across space. For 1D space, let's use a really simple analogy. Imagine a hiking trail. If you want to know the total net change in your elevation after a long hike, you don't need to add up every single microscopic hill and valley along the way, do you? Nope. That net change is just the difference between your starting point's elevation and your ending point's elevation. The interior path totally doesn't matter. Only the boundary points do. Now think about this special case. If your hiking trail is a closed loop, meaning you start and end at the exact same spot, your net elevation change is exactly 0. Boom. This is precisely what the math of a closed line integral shows with the gradient theorem. The boundary points are identical, so the net change is just 0. Stepping up to 2D space, picture a butterfly net. If you want to know how much aerodynamic force is acting on it, you could painstakingly measure the wind catching the whole fabric net itself, or you can just measure the physical tension on the rigid wire rim holding that net open. Much easier, right? Stokes' theorem is the mathematical translation for this exact scenario. It lets us convert the closed line integral, which is our wire rim, into an open surface integral, which is the stretched net. So by integrating the curl over the net, we get the exact same result as evaluating the flow around the wire rim. It's beautiful. Finally, jumping into 3D space, imagine a water balloon. If you hook it up to a faucet and turn the water on, you can try to measure the actual volume of water expanding inside the core. Or, you can just measure how much the rubber skin stretches on the outside surface. Gauss's theorem perfectly maps this 3D relationship. The formula basically gives us a function to convert the outer shell's closed surface integral, the stretching rubber, directly into the internal core's volume integral, which is the expanding water. And here, the mathematical operator used to bridge that gap, that's divergence. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this repeating pattern. Applying a differential operator, like gradient, curl, or divergence, to an interior region is always perfectly equivalent to evaluating its boundary. 1 dimension steps down to 0, 2 dimensions step down to 1, and 3 step down to 2. It's literally the same architectural rule all the way down. All right, section 4, the closed surface rule. Before we get into the actual coordinate math, we really need to do a quick reality check on the geometric rules, especially for 3D space. For Gauss's theorem to actually work, we have to contrast true closed spaces that actually enclose a volume against open surfaces that enclose absolutely nothing. I mean, you can't measure the water expanding inside a balloon if the balloon doesn't hold any water, right? Notice how this builds on itself. A sphere or a cylinder perfectly traps a 3-dimensional volume inside. Those are totally valid closed surfaces. But think about a flat disk. It's basically just an open hoop. It bounds exactly 0 volume. You absolutely cannot use Gauss's theorem on a flat disk because there is no 3D interior to connect the boundary. Moving on to Section 5, the Universal Coordinate Toolkit. Now we arrive at the master key. This is the toolkit that is going to save you from endless rote memorization. Just think about it. Cartesian, cylindrical, spherical. Normally, these sound like a nightmare mess of complex formulas. But what if we could collapse all of them into one single cheat code? You seriously don't need 12 formulas. You only need 4 master formulas. Here's how we pull this off. Instead of locking ourselves into rigid x, y, and z axes, we replace them with generalized coordinates, u, v, and w. Then, we add what we call scale factors, f, g, and h. Think of these kind of like distortion metrics. A sphere curves differently than a flat grid, right? Well, these 3 little letters mathematically account for all that stretching and bending, creating master formulas that work for literally any system. All right, final section, decoding the math operators. Let's see how this master blueprint completely trivializes the actual anatomy of the math operators. Imagine a sort of Rosetta Stone translation matrix that tells you exactly what the scale factors f, g, and h are for Cartesian, spherical, and cylindrical systems. To use the gradient and divergence formulas, you just plug in those scale factors. In the gradient formula, they act as simple external divisors. For divergence, they're trapped inside the partial derivatives. You don't have to memorize a spherical divergence formula from scratch. You just swap out the letters. It's a total game changer. And this brilliantly extends to the curl and Laplacian operators, too. Think about the nested derivative structure for the Laplacian. The scale factors neatly slide right into the formula, doing all the heavy lifting of the curve geometry for you. If you know this basic structure and your Rosetta Stone matrix, you can instantly generate the correct equation for any spatial system. Once you see this underlying blueprint, the boundary interior connections scaling up perfectly through the dimensions, and the universal coordinates doing all the heavy geometric lifting, the entire universe of vector calculus just completely opens up to you. It's elegant. So I'll leave you with this. What other mathematically complex concepts in your life are just waiting to be simplified by finding their single underlying pattern?